In this lecture, we're going to be talking about UI sliders. Now, UI sliders are similar to UI segmented controls, which we learnt about in the previous lecture, in terms of it's one object that can give you multiple outcomes. But the difference with a slider, it can really give you a lot of multiple outcomes, and it can control a value of another object within the application. And what I mean by that, if I find a slider right now, just scroll down and place and drag one in. What we're doing this to example UI sliders is it's going to control the size of the font within our label. Now, as we increase the size of our slider, it will increase the text of our label. So it will get bigger and smaller, and vice versa. If it goes smaller, it will get smaller. If it goes bigger, it will get bigger. Now, this is because the slider is going to control the font size value within the label. And as we move it up and down, it's instantly going to update it every time we move it. So what I'm going to do first then, before we get onto it in more depth, is just quickly add in our actions and outlets. And then we can explain more on what the slider is going to do. So I'm going to add an outlet for our label. Simply call it label. We need an outlet for our slider, as we need to determine the value of the slider to control other values. So I'll simply name this one slider. And then we need an action as well, so we can control the slider and have our user have its own input. So I simply name this slider action, making sure that is a action and the connection, and add that in. Okay, so before we come back to our interface, we're going to jump straight into our viewcontroller.m. And within our slider, we're going to write the code to show you how it's going to work. So we've changed the font of labels previously before when we learnt about text properties earlier in the course. And what we do is do bracket self.label space set font, and the font here we're going to do bracket UI font space font with name. Do @ symbol, 2 quotation marks, and we can simply name a simple font within our system, which we're going to use Verdana. And the size here, we could put in 20, and when we load up our application, it means it's going to set the size of the text in the font to the size 20. That's what we learned about previously before. But how we can make it increase and decrease on the slider is pretty simple. We type in self.slider.value. So that means whatever the value of the slider is equals the size of the font within the label. Now, how do we determine what the value is of the slider? That's pretty simple. Head back into our main.storyboard. We just have to slide it up and down. But if we select it, you would notice that the value is currently set on minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. So as it stands as default, which basically means we can only allow our font to go to a maximum size of 1, which is going to be really small and we're not going to see it. So what we're going to do is change this to something pretty big. Let's go for 80, and the minimum we can go down to, let's say that is, let's say it's 17, as that's what the font should be standard. Yep, 17. So in its current state, at being 17, as you can see here, if I change it to 50, that will move the slider up. But if we set the current state to 17, that's at its lowest on the slider, which is what the current label size is. So as it increases all the way to 80, it will change the value of the label's font, which we've set in our code. So if you go to build and run to test it out, so as you can see, it's at its 0. Well, it's not at 0, it's at 17, it's lowest it can possibly go. But as we increase the slider, you can see that now our text label is increasing. Now, the reason we're getting a kind of instant feedback is because this action is performed when we interact with our slider. So as you can see, it moves as we move the slider. Now we go as high as possible, which is 80, which is the most we can display in our label because our slider will not allow us to go any further. That's because that's 80. If I set it to 100, we could go a bit further and get the label bigger. And we can do the opposite, make it smaller and bring it down. So as you can see there, we get a kind of instant feedback on our label, and it's a great example to show you how the value of a slider can control another value or another property of an object in the application. Now you would have seen these sliders quite everywhere really. Maybe they change the brightness of the screen, which they do in your device already, and even adjust the volume of the sound within your application. It's another form of letting your users control the outputs or the inputs of your application. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about sliders more in depth as we go on to create our 5th application and create our very own temperature calculator.